Russia's economy isn't collapsing. Stores are open. Wages are being paid. The ruble is still standing. But underneath that surface stability, something far more dangerous is happening. Every month, Russia is spending billions, not to grow, not to invest, but simply to hold the system in place, to keep the currency stable, to keep budgets balanced, to keep the illusion of normal functioning alive. And that kind of economy doesn't break loudly. It gets quietly drained. Because when an economy is forced to spend this much just to avoid sliding backward, it starts making trade-offs that don't show up in headlines, but they compound over time. In this video, we're not talking about collapse timelines or dramatic predictions. We're breaking down how Russia's economy is being slowly hollowed out, where the money is going, why it has to keep going there, and what that means for the country's financial future. Once you see the mechanism, this strong economy narrative starts to look very different. To understand this drain, you have to separate what Russia's economy looks like from what it's being forced to do. On paper, key indicators still look stable. The ruble hasn't collapsed. Government spending continues. Energy revenues are still flowing. But that stability isn't organic anymore. It's being manufactured through policy, and policy always has a cost. Over the past 2 years, Russia has built an economy that depends on constant intervention. The central bank is stepping in to support the currency. The government is redirecting massive resources toward war-related spending. Capital controls are quietly shaping where money can move and where it can't. None of this shows up as an immediate crisis. In fact, in the short term, it works. But the problem is repetition. When an economy has to keep pulling the same levers month after month just to stay flat, it's no longer stabilizing. It's absorbing losses. Every intervention replaces market pressure with fiscal pressure. Instead of prices adjusting naturally, the state pays the difference. And that's where the drain begins. Because these aren't one-time costs. They stack. They repeat. And they quietly reshape the entire economic system around survival rather than growth. In the next section, we'll break down the specific tools Russia is using to maintain this stability and why each one makes the drain harder to stop. Stability at this scale isn't free, and it isn't abstract. To defend the ruble and keep financial conditions from tightening too fast, Russia has been forced into persistent, expensive interventions. That includes direct currency support, subsidized lending, emergency spending, and priority funding for war-related industries. Estimates vary, but the combined cost of these efforts runs into billions of dollars every single month. And here's the critical part. This isn't money being spent once and recovered later. It has to be spent again and again just to keep conditions from worsening. That creates a brutal trade-off. Every ruble used to stabilize the system is a ruble not used for long-term investment, infrastructure, productivity, innovation, or consumer growth. Instead of building future capacity, the economy is paying a kind of maintenance fee just to stay where it is. Over time, that shifts the entire budget structure. Spending becomes defensive. Flexible funds disappear. Margins for error shrink. This is why the drain is so dangerous. The economy doesn't collapse, it narrows. Options disappear. Policy choices become limited. And the cost of any future shock rises sharply. In the next section, we'll look at what this constant pressure does to growth, policy, and risk, and why even small disruptions start to matter much more than they used to. The first place this quiet drain shows up is growth. When resources are constantly redirected towards stabilization and war-related spending, productive investment takes a back seat. Businesses operate, but expansion slows. Innovation becomes riskier. The economy keeps moving, just not forward. The second pressure zone is policy distortion. Instead of responding to market signals, policy becomes reactive. Interest rates stay higher than they otherwise would. Capital controls remain in place longer. Emergency measures turn into permanent features. Over time, the system adapts, but in a way that prioritizes control over efficiency. And the third pressure zone is risk sensitivity. When an economy has already absorbed so much pressure, it becomes far more vulnerable to small shocks. A dip in energy revenue, a spike in military costs, or tighter external restrictions don't need to be catastrophic to matter. They just need to arrive at the wrong time. This doesn't break the system. It narrows the margin for error. And that's the key idea to hold on to. Because the quieter the drain, the less attention it gets, and the harder it becomes to reverse. In the final section, we step back and ask the most important question, not whether Russia's economy can survive this, but what it's giving up to do so. At this point, the question isn't whether Russia's economy can continue functioning under pressure. It can. The real question is what kind of economy it's becoming in order to do that. Because when stability depends on constant intervention, the system slowly reorients itself around defense rather than growth. Resources flow towards sectors that are politically necessary, not economically efficient. Private investment becomes cautious. Long-term planning shrinks. And over time, that changes behavior. Businesses stop thinking in decades and start thinking in quarters. Consumers adjust expectations downward. The state becomes the central allocator of risk, and risk, once centralized, becomes harder to manage. What makes this especially fragile is that the strategy works best when nothing changes. As long as energy revenues hold, costs remain predictable, and external pressure doesn't intensify, the drain stays manageable. But economies don't operate in static environments. They face shocks, technological, geopolitical, financial, and each one becomes harder to absorb when flexibility has already been traded away. This is why this strong economy narrative is misleading. Strength isn't about surviving pressure today. It's about retaining the ability to adapt tomorrow. An economy that has to spend billions just to hold its position isn't collapsing, but it's also not building resilience. It's consuming it. And that's the quiet danger. Because when the drain finally becomes visible, the choices available to respond are far fewer than they used to be. Once an economy restructures itself around constant intervention, it doesn't snap back easily. Temporary measures change incentives. Emergency tools reshape institutions. And eventually, the system starts to expect support rather than respond to signals. You can see this in how credit is allocated. You can see it in which industries receive priority funding. And you can see it in how risk is priced, or no longer priced at all. When the state absorbs more and more uncertainty, private actors stop carrying it. That feels stabilizing in the short term, but it quietly transfers volatility into the future. Another overlooked consequence is opportunity cost across time, not just across sectors. Money spent today to hold the line is money that cannot generate compounding returns tomorrow. Infrastructure delayed doesn't just slow growth once, it slows it repeatedly. Missed investment windows don't reopen on demand. This is how economies fall behind without visibly falling apart. They keep functioning. They keep producing. But the distance between where they are and where they could have been quietly widens. And that gap matters. Because in a global system where capital, technology, and productivity move fast, standing still is a form of regression. What makes Russia's case unique is not that it's under pressure. Many economies are. But that the pressure is being managed through continuous financial sacrifice rather than adjustment. That strategy buys time. But time isn't free. It has to be paid for every month. And eventually, the question shifts again, not from can this continue, but from what happens when the cost rises faster than the system can absorb. That's the moment when quiet drains stop being quiet. Not because something suddenly breaks, but because the space to maneuver disappears. And when that happens, the headlines change. Not because the economy collapsed overnight, but because the underlying resilience was already spent. That's why watching the mechanisms matters more than watching the numbers. And why the most important economic stories often unfold long before they look dramatic. If you want to understand those stories, the slow-moving pressures that shape outcomes years before they become obvious, this channel is built around exactly that.